Is that better?
Oh, yes, yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. Good evening. Oki na kokoax. Nitaniku Sikimiotas, Amskapi Pakani. My name is Donnie Wetzel Jr. I'm the Tribal Relations and Resiliency Director at OPI. I'm Blackfeet, part of Amskapi Pakani, part of the Ixkanai Society and various things. So today I'm going to do my best on sharing some of the things in the importance of sovereignty and the work that we do in my unit, along with all of the folks at In Education. If those of you are hip hop heads, this title is kind of a spin-off of when the Outkast won Rap Album of the Year, beating the West Coast and the East Coast with Tupac and Dre and all those guys and Biggie Smalls. Our indigenous nations got something to say. I know that's not grammatically correct, but that's kind of where I was going with this. So welcome. I'll just kind of get into this. I'm really honored to have Jennifer ask me to be a part of this. The other sessions have been absolutely phenomenal. I don't know if I'll be able to match what some of those folks brought up, but I'll do my best. I also, Jennifer shared some of the topics that have come up over the last few sessions, and if I can address some of that. Much of my work is really on the ground in our tribal nations, working in our school districts, on our reservation communities, working with our urban Indian youth across the state. And Jennifer really covered a lot of who I am, but I'll get into it a little bit more. So happy New Year to everybody. You know, I think one of the most important things in my life is my family and in where I've come from. And so I like to always start off with this. That center picture is my family, my son Xavier, my daughter Nevaeh, my wife Kesley. I also have an older son, Everson. Up in that top left is my grandfather, Walter Blackie Wetzel. Blackie was the Blackfeet Nation chairman from, I think, 51 to 64. He was also the president of the National Congress of American Indians. He was a very influential person in my life and just made some great changes. He really fought the Termination Act. And if you guys follow the news, there's a little discussions around that going on around our state. But the man laid a foundation. He built many great friendships with John F. Kennedy and Mike Mansfield, Lee Metcalf, and so many others. Up in the top right is my mother's family, my aunts and uncles. For those of you out there who follow the basketball, that's where we get a lot of our height, is from my mom's family. She had a few 7-footers there. Then you drop down there and there's my father, who is an amazing idol and just a leader and mentor to me. He's a great father. He really taught me the resiliency of our people. He was a coach, he was an administrator, he was an athlete, and has done many things. And I take a lot from both my folks. They're pretty amazing people. And then in the bottom left is my brothers and sisters in the Horn Society with the Blackfeet Nation. And it's really given me a taste of what our people have held for so long in our societies, the brotherhood and sisterhood that we have there. So that's a little bit about me. And again, I'm honored to be here. I've worked in Indian education, I think, for 12 years now. I first initially, right out of college, started to work for the Montana Wyoming Tribal Leaders Council. So I was there for about 13 years. And I ran quite a few programs. I really focused on suicide prevention. I ran a grant for 6 years on 8 sovereign nations. And one of the things that I like to look at is those lessons learned. And I grew up in Browning. I was born and raised in Browning. and we moved around all over the state. We were a pretty nomadic family. I even went to 3 high schools, and it's crazy to think of that. But I graduated up in Belknap at Harlem High School, and then went down and played basketball at MSU Billings. I was recruited when it was Eastern, and I played 1 year when it was Eastern. That's what it should still be, I think. But out of college, I worked at the Tribal Leaders, did the suicide prevention, and then Superintendent Denise Juneau um, contacted me because they were starting a new program. And I was doing a lot of youth leadership at the time with legends like Ernie Bighorn and Clayton Small, Theda Newbreast. I was under the wings of some amazing folks, Dr. Ken Ryan. So I was learning a lot growing up in them, you know, in the shadow of those legends. And along with Gordon Belcourt, who was an amazing boss to me, taught me the ins and outs of various things. But when I came into OPI, the basis of much of my work coming from the suicide prevention world and the heaviness of that was, how can we get ahead of everything? How can we teach our youth the skills to love who they are and the ability to take and handle tough situations they may deal with in life? Well, that's education in a lot of ways. So I'd like to share this here a little bit. The Tribal Relations and Resiliency Unit is about 2 years old. It is kind of based within our tribal relations with our sovereign nations in our state. But you can see a lot of like what we prepare. We want our kids to have that preparation to deal with life and some of the things that may come. We really focus on building the relationships and understanding each other. As you can see, I'm Blackfeet, but I'm also German and Irish. I was always centered in my identity, I guess, because I was in sports pretty heavy. And I've always wanted, and I've always witnessed, and I've always tried to make happen a unification of all of us as diverse people. And so that's what the relationship parts really means to me. I bring this up a lot. Henrietta Mann once was talking about the most difficult journey is 14 inches. It's your mind to your heart. And so I've never forgot that. I bring that up. She's another one of my mentors, along with my great uncle, Earl Barlow, who was one of the individuals who put that 1972 language in the Constitution with the help of many, many other people. But we try to keep our heart in the work that we have in everything we do. The 7-generation understandings, the direction I go from there is, I am not here for me. I'm here for all of those who laid the foundation for me to get here. My mother, my father, my grandparents, so on and so forth, on down the line. And everything that I do will affect my children, their grandchildren. So I must be here in this present state for them, for those who brought me here, and for those far ahead into the future. And so every decision I make, I have to make it in that way, that I'm going to leave them with the good life ahead, and do the best I can to raise them and love them. So I like to put that because that eliminates ego. It's an understanding of my place in this world. One of the biggest things that I like to emphasize is reconnecting to our roots. The simple understanding that a tree will not thrive without its roots. With some of the things I'll talk about today, there was an attempt to cut our roots from our people, and it was a pretty intense attempt, and many were lost during that time. But with much of the efforts, I look to try to reconnect that. I look in different ways of trying to get that cultural understandings that are within our indigenous nations out to our youth, if they don't have it, or if they may have a difficult situation at home and no access to such things. That's kind of what that statement means. And it goes across the board to everybody. And I hope I convey that message today, that we're all in this together. It doesn't matter who or where you're from. In our histories, we're pretty much all in the same boat. And that simplicity of the golden rule is a big thing. And then one of my elders is Leonard Bastine Apamaka. we have different kind of concepts and descriptions of our tribal nations. I think Blackfeet have some pretty heavy ones, the Raiders of the Plains, and some of them growing up, I was like, really, oh yeah, that's us. We'll take over when needed. But I've really learned through some of our elders that at least within our tribe, we always led with ultimate love. And there's nothing that can combat love. Love is a very powerful thing. And of course, we lead with that first, but if we figure out things ain't going in that direction, then we protected our people. So I like to often bring that up because it really gives an understanding and a starting place of who and what I am in my work and the direction that I often go. So one of the most difficult things about sovereignty is spelling it. I still don't know how to spell it, but I learned, I had a lot of good practice with this. And I can't thank Jennifer enough for asking me to come in here and speak on this. So I know that many of you have been to the other presentation. So this is just kind of the basic definitions of sovereignty. And you could see that it's pretty much written in the government. It's in the treaties. There's different kind of approaches. Where I wanted to go with this presentation is a little bit more on the substance of what it means, what it does for my work. I once had an elder tell me that sovereignty for tribes is BS, but he said the whole word. And he talked about how we still have a superintendent of BIA that looks over all of our tribal work and has to sign off on anything we do. And I understand that. There's a lot of troubling things in our relationship with the federal government. Our tribes are government to government level. And in my past work with the Tribal Leaders Council, I was honored to work at those levels with many people in DC and at NCAI and various groups, the Council of Large Land-Based Tribes, which is now COLT. But I was always told by Earl Oldperson, Mickey Pablo, Bert Cochran, Joe Ironman, all of these guys I grew up with. You're young and you don't realize the power and the energy in that room. When they were explaining what the Tribal Leaders Council was, it was for our tribes to practice their sovereignty and unite as one with one voice when we deal with such things at a federal level. So that's always what sovereignty was to me in those ways. It's a battle constantly to remain sovereign and to create these relationships with the federal government where they're actually fulfilling the treaty obligations, which really doesn't happen. I'll cover that a little bit more, but I won't be the one that reads the slides, but I might have death by PowerPoint slides for you guys, too much of this. So this here is a picture of us. In my work, we work towards creating authentic consultation with our tribal nations. I'll get into it a little bit more in the next few slides, but the tribes have a say in many of the situations and the funding that comes down for our American Indian youth in the state, across the nation. And they have the ability to offer support and guidance. When we go out there, I always emphasize to anyone I'm working with that our tribes walking in, or our elected leaders, locally there might be this and that, but that's politics. But in a statewide scope, in the federal scope, in the world scope, our elected leaders are like if the presidents of France or Italy comes walking in the room. That's the level of what sovereignty is for our tribal nations. I often get frustrated because people don't hold our tribal nations and elected leaders at that high regard, and they should. Through Congress, we have, you can see the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and within the Indian tribes. All of this is within the Constitution. And you can see some of those quotes. Indian nations had always been considered as distinct independent political communities. retaining their original natural rights. So these nations that we hold were here for way before any kind of contact into this northern hemisphere. And so, like, working with our tribal nations, it's very important to understand why we're sovereign and why we're given this right to govern ourselves. There was a lot of ceded lands that were given up for those that were coming. And I've talked to many of the old folks and old timers that possessions was something that we just never really thought of. So to own the land was foreign, and it was more like we had a relationship with the land. We didn't take too much. If we did, we offered back. And so when those earlier treaties were written, when some of the things that went down with some of that, there was quite a few atrocities going down. But I always look at it like this. My grandfather said reservations is well, at least we got something, because I've had a lot of discussions over my years that people say, well, we should have just, we could have not given the tribes anything. I said, I understand that, but I think that the fact that the way things were going and that the tribes are actually giving land, of course, it started to get cut down, but that's a big deal right there. And I'll cover some of that stuff. So within all of this, the relationship the federal government had with the indigenous nations of this continent, in the ability that we had to give access to lands and to help support some of the folks that came across the ocean just to survive in this country. It was always a given. We were always giving people. I was told once by John Eagle, he's a Standing Rock Sioux tribal member. There's a terminology that when Columbus landed, they say he was lost and he was heading to India. John Eagle made a very interesting argument to me once. He said, during the time of Columbus, India wasn't even a nation. It wasn't even there. It wasn't a country. It was like his Pakistan or something, he said. So he often believed, and I've read this before, that when Columbus and his folks came across to this land, they seen the people, they said, en Dio, in God. He said they were so beautiful and perfectly just well taken care of, their hair and their body. Everything was just in good shape, and he looked at them as they were in God, in God's light. And so I like to take that. I'm going to tell you one thing. I'm just sharing my opinions. I'm going to share my thoughts. And it's what I've learned in life is that you guys can take it or leave it. You can take it and use it or whatever. I know I've been ridiculed at times for butting in when one elder tells me something and another tells me another thing, and I kind of say, well, he said this, they said that. But I've learned that you take in everything that's coming and you can make it your own. So I've chose to take that definition from John Eagle on where the word Indian came from. So tribal governments, a lot of folks don't understand. It's the fact that we elect our tribal leaders. They have to do just as much work as the state does, as the nation does. You look at all of these programs that they have to do. Of course, it's on the westernized government approaches and structure, but this is within all of our tribal nations. This is happening. They are a nation within the nation, and our tribal leaders do the best they can. But sovereignty has allowed us to do these things, to practice or create our social programs, to get a workforce development program, to work on our land management. All of these things, the road structures, various things like that. Some of those obstacles are those unfulfilled treaty obligations. One time I was sitting in Valier, and sometimes I'm just thinking out loudly, and the roads were just clear, and I was coming from Browning, and I turned to Valier, and them roads after I left the res were just clear. And I was sitting here thinking, geez, I just went through a blizzard. Those kids, we had a lot of questions about the tribes. Here they live right off the reservation. And I often think that, without the lack of funding that comes down from the federal government. You know, we do lack quality snow plows at times. We do lack resources. We do lack various things that really hurts our people. It's like our Indian Health Service. Um, the funding that we receive is never been fully funded, and they have a level of needs that the tribes must go and approach the federal government for when they're dealing with getting funding for IHS. You know, our hospitals rarely have the services of surgeries. Uh, it's a big problem. It's why there was such an epidemic around prescription drugs. When you had a simple issue with your ankle or your wrist or whatever, any other place, the health service would be able to fix that thing. And in a lot of our cases, pills were divvied out like anything. And it caused a lot of issues. You know, I've lost a lot of people around this thing. So there's so much that comes from these unfulfilled treaty obligations. And you know, I was looking at some of the work of my grandfather. If you guys ever want to look up a show, it was an episode on NBC, and you can search it out there. The American Stranger is what it's called. Look up that, and it was an episode that talked about the true what our Indian people were dealing with. And my grandfather had a big part in getting that episode shot, and it was during the Termination Act era. But within that, he was discussing how the lack of treaty obligations being fulfilled, where we are to take care of our folks and the welfare of our people, the revenue our tribes often were gaining from leasing lands or cattle or various sources of revenue, actually were going to help our people because we didn't have a lot of jobs for them. So that revenue that the tribe was earning often went back to help the people. Now it's what it's always about, but it gets a little frustrating when people will talk about the state of our tribal nations. Another book that is pretty strong in that is Neither Wolf Nor Dog. If you guys have not read that, I encourage you to do so. But those are some of the obstacles. I think even at the state level, we see this. Government is clunky, and it's got a lot of hoops that you jump through to get things going. So I was going to get a little bit into some of the history. You know, American Indians are not a race. They are the indigenous nations of this northern hemisphere. They have a unique relationship with the federal government through those treaties. I've already kind of covered this. But those treaties are to handle and provide health, law, and education to our people. There's often been arguments on, with all of these schools and the education piece of the federal government's treaty obligation, where's that funding sitting right now? Because there's no more boarding schools, really. There is, but it is an interesting argument. But those treaties, they sit the highest of the high, and you know, in the creation of our reservations, those were basically labels as prison camps, and they turned them into reservations. But you know, you put a people that traveled with the seasons and moved with the seasons, or moved with the buffalo, specifically in the Plains tribes. You put them in a reservation, and then you offer them rations. You take away their entire way of life. You take out their food, and some of those rations aren't the healthiest of the healthy. You know, so if you guys think about this, this was only 150 some years ago, and it's caused a lot of situations out there. And again, sovereignty is to afford us that these things get taken care of until the grass grows and the rivers flows. That was written in there. So our tribes are members of the U.S. and state citizens. Their heritage, their cultural identity, distinct, very distinct and unique. Sovereignty recognizes a tribe's claim to independent identity and citizenship tied to their language, practice, and a holistic way of life. I often think about that, and I'm going to start to get into this a little bit more. What has sovereignty allowed us to do as tribal nations? Without sovereignty, our indigenous tribes would become a cultural group or race with no further status in the various states and the federal government. I can't read all that, but you guys can read it. My picture's in the way. With no obligation. Without sovereignty, a tribe has no more claim to their heritage, their sacred sites and cultural practices and language, as their indigenous roots and understandings would be severed, making them people searching for a place of belonging. And I say this to no offense to anybody, but I speak a lot on identity. Identity is a very important thing, I think, in anyone's life. People that are centered in their identity, they're very comfortable in any situation. Sometimes our identity becomes the stuff the material objects we obtain, becomes the degree I may hold, or the job that I have, the car that I have, the house that I have. Am I a red or a blue? Am I politically this way or that way? Comes down to our skin color. Now, our tribes never, if you look at some of these things, and I'll get into it a little bit later, but I've come to learn that, you know, the color of skin, the blood quantum, that's a whole nother topic. But we have to understand who and what we are, and that really comes down to the DNA, your heritage. You have a lot of folks going and doing DNA tests. Those DNA tests don't say black, brown, white on them. They say an indigenous nation. And I want you guys to go back and think about this. An indigenous nation, and being indigenous just means you're on your native land, where your people thrived and what you're connected to, where your language is connected to, the dances, the histories, the traditions, the societies, the clan systems. You know, I'll always bring up, look at Braveheart. Those Scottish folks had clan systems. They fought to keep their languages. It goes back to the beginning of time. It was usually a power push of control that knocked folks out of being indigenous. And so we've created a lot of some situations in America, but I'll tell you this, that we're so far evolved from other countries because we take a shot at this of coming together united. And we got a ways to go, but there's a lot that our tribes can help in making that happen. Tribal identity, both at the individual level and the tribal level, would diminish, and another indigenous population would vanish. That's what sovereignty affords us. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's what it's allowed us to do, is to keep who and what we are while connected to our indigenous lands. I always try to have folks understand this and relate to this, because we have so much rhetoric of separation. I really like that meme there with the natives up top and them Scots on the bottom. I mean, that's the truth. You know, I mean, it's how it is out there. When you look at these different quotes, that I just put a search out there on sovereignty. The funny thing is that Yellowstone season 2, that Monica, if you guys watch Yellowstone, you know, she got up in front of that class and said that, and I was like, that's it right there. We are so related in our histories and in our experience that it gets difficult how we separate each other and separate, oh, they're this or they're that. We've all, in one way, shape, or form, have went through some sort of subjugation. And it could be 1,000 years ago, it could be 150 years ago, 50 years ago. But I really want to emphasize that part of this, and why the beauty of sovereignty has allowed us to hold on to some of that indigenous knowledge of who and what we are. To make my point a little bit more clear, you know, in America, like I said earlier, we separate folks by color. You know, we have white folks, black, brown, different things like that. Or we have African American, Native American, which is a weird concept. But it would be like me going over to Europe, and I put that colored Europe map. It'd be like me going over there just lumping everybody there that has light skin as white people. And you just don't go to Europe and say, hey, so you don't collect data or things like that by saying, here's white folks, here's this and that. Some of the things that also really connect to us is if I'm in Europe and I call an Irishman a Brit, I'm going to get punched in the face. It's like many of our tribes here in this nation. If you call, a Blackfeet anything but Blackfeet, you might get punched in the face, or we'll laugh about it. But I want you to think of those two concepts. I played a lot of basketball, and in college, this is actually an actual experience that I had. We had a lot of African American, my good teammates from Long Beach and Dallas and Houston, and I got them. I got a couple of them to come to the powwow with me, the Eastern Montana powwow, and they were just intrigued. They said, "Hey, this is how we were in our original lands in Africa." I said, "Yeah, man, yeah." And they were like, "Why don't all of you guys come together? Why don't all the tribes come together and join forces and sing Kumbaya? That's what we've done here. We've really united." And I said, "Well, it's apples and oranges. Now, if Africa all got together and united, that would be very similar to us in this continent, because each one of our tribes are very unique. They have their own languages, cultures, their traditions, ceremonies. Some are very similar, and it's usually based on the language. But we're proud of who we are in various ways, and so I just wanted to make people kind of pull back and think about that as we move forward. My good friend and mentor, Mike Jetty, I was talking one time, and every time I'm talking, he says, "Hey, that's in a book," or "Hey, I got a quote for you." This is the quote that I grabbed onto as we came into working within our tribal communities in our school districts. There is so much of doing onto our people. We never do with, or very often listen. And you sit and you look, we've tried everything out there to get, our scores up, to get education to be at a higher level. We're always 10, 20 points below an American Indians with other folks in the state. It gets very frustrating. But I've always looked at that data in a way that data is saying that what we are doing is wrong. We're not doing it with them, or we're not even asking our tribal nations, how can we work together to get that experience going? So this quote really hit me when Mike gave it to me. Insert culture into education instead of inserting education into culture. That's the problem, is we need to insert education into the culture. Now, you could look at that in a way that our tribes weren't allowed to practice our cultural way of life legally till 1978. And so you think about that. That was in my lifetime. I'm getting up there in age now, but they tried to knock out all of that. And we were resilient enough and kept many of who and what we were. And from 78 to now, there has been a revitalization. I remember growing up in Browning, I didn't have a lot of things going on around such things as culture. And now I go up there. Of course, I'm part of that, and I'm so honored and blessed to be part of a lot of that. But you have kids getting access to things. I bring it up a lot. You have students now. Everywhere you go, our young women are wearing ribbon skirts. Our young men are wearing ribbon shirts. There's this pride that's coming out. Our language is coming back in various ways. We have different strategies to maintain that. And so much of that is coming. So I want to get to my point. Sometimes within our reservation communities, our tribal schools look like this. I notice this a lot in different kind of tribal events, because like I said earlier, I worked for the tribal nations before I came to the school districts. At the tribal level, I hardly ever seen a lot of collaborations with the schools. Um, there wasn't a lot of intermingling. And those school districts were just kind of left on their own. And I understand that. And what I always wanted to look at is these young people in their tribal settings, um, in the culture and the way of life that we've held through sovereignty, act very honorable and respectful in their settings, in their own tribal settings. And then I see them in the classroom and they're bouncing off walls, and I pull them aside. I said, what's going on? And this what do we call it? This code switching, this way of life that many of our youth are meant to live, gets very frustrating. We're working in a system that in the beginning was in full assimilation. So when we started to talk about discipline issues in our school systems, I was talking with youth and I asked them, why are you acting like that towards that teacher? I've never seen you act like that. And you're just a completely different person in the school. And that young man said, this school isn't my home. I just got to come here and do this. I just can't wait for basketball to start. And so I met with some various folks, some various knowledge keepers around, and I said, what can we do within the school system to blur the lines where our kids can be who they are and as tribal people, but also take in what the westernized knowledge and teachings have shown. So I'll share a little bit of that as we started to move forward. But in my current position, this is one of the key components that has allowed my position to be created and my unit to be created. Within ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and for those, I mean, you're all educators here, I assume, but it used to be No Child Left Behind, and then it moved to the Every Student Succeeds Act. But within that act, they looked at authentic tribal consultation. These are the levels of where that goes. These are the programs where that fits. So we're, like I said, we're 2 years in, and we've really been pushing a lot of education to our tribal nations on where their voice fits into a school system. Now, there's a lot of hard feelings at times with these two entities. And I believe that if we can do this the right way with the youth as the main focus, we can bring the schools in our districts and our tribes, if they're not working together in a very good way, we can bring them together. And to share, like I'm saying, bring in our knowledge keepers, bring in some of that, bring in some of our programs that may be over at the tribes or maybe at the schools. Come together and unify in those type of ways. Some of our tribal schools and our tribal nations are doing that right now, but this is the nuts and bolts of what tribal consultation in ESSA is. That's section 8538. You can find a guideline book on our website on the tribal relations and resiliency that if you ever need supports or services at the district or the tribal level, you can contact us and we could come out, we could help try to bring more collaborative efforts around funding for youth, around supports for youth, or whatever it may be. So like I said, I shared that I work in the suicide prevention world. If anybody's ever been in that, or it's just us as humans, if there's a lot of emotion or energy around a topic or sitting down with somebody, in this case, if someone is having a tough time, and I do assist trainings. If you guys have ever been to something like that, applied suicide intervention skills training. At the individual level, when someone is having a tough time, you go in there and you ask them, what's going on, and then you let them talk. Oftentimes, we live in a world that will be judgmental. If someone said, "Well, this is happening to me, and I'm not having a good time with it," or "This happened, my girl left," or this or that. What we often do is say, "Oh, well, that ain't nothing. This is what I'm going through," and we try to one up each other. So there's this moment, if you actually sit back and listen objectively, that a person will just dump out, and that energy will start to calm because they have someone sitting there listening to them for the first time. And by the end, their mind will start to clear. The brain cannot function in trauma. I think we all know that. And so, how can we get to a place where we're actually clearing the mind and people are working together? I have found that in our first year and a half of tribal consultation, be it at the school level or at the tribal level, there will be a lot of energy and anger at times. Well, we have to do this, or we have this, the school board, this, that. And it is a difficult situation, but once we start to talk, those vents will clear and we'll start to get to a place that we will start to collaborate, work together. I truly believe that the consultation efforts, if our school districts are writing plans, the dream is that they write those plans with the tribes and they work together, they share resources. Fort Belknap, when they got the COVID funds, we were in discussions about possibly creating a campus out at Hayes Lodgepole, getting tribal housing to offer, a student housing unit for girls, one for boys, get a cultural center right in the middle, because some of the situations that happen at home are tough to break. We can do all we can within our school systems, but that learned behavior is difficult. So would there be an option for a safe house? You talk to any students out there in our world, safe house is something that they're always looking for. If things aren't going good at home, I'd like to maybe crash out here. We have kids couch surfing. For those that work in that world, that's the truth right there. So what if we were to combine and create something like that? Heart Butte has done a little bit of that stuff, and it's pretty exciting to see. But that's what I see in our consultation efforts. How can we work together, schedule that out for the year? Local control is a pretty strong thing that our schools can do a lot with local control, and sovereignty comes right into play with all of that. What are the policies that we work with around those things? You look at connect the tribe's identity and voice into the education of our youth. Many of our students out there are lost, and you have on one side of the spectrum students that have grown up in their traditional way of understanding and knowing. Maybe their folks have maintained that, their grandparents. And so they sit over there, and those youth are really often very healthy and centered in doing what they are. On the other side, you have folks that will fully just go, I'm going to go this route. I'm going to jump into this world here and fully assimilate. Both sides are fine. One thing also that I've learned is that we can never judge anybody on the decisions they make. That's their way. Go for it. But in the middle, we have many, many lost youth. When I talk about identity, I grew up as an athlete, and everywhere I went, I was an athlete, or people knew me as an athlete. I rarely talk about a lot of my athletics, but it got me through. But when I lost that, I had a big hole that I needed to fill, and I was filling it with the wrong things. And I was actually, that's when I went back to my Blackfeet ways. And Georgia Malikikin woman gave me my name, Sikimiotas, which is Black Horse, which is connected to my grandfather, Sixenum, Blackfeet man. So when I started to understand some of that stuff, it really started to center me. So is there possibilities, you look at that bottom part there, to connect those type of opportunities to kids that are lost out there? I know many school districts are doing this. And again, I go back to, this is what sovereignty has brought us. It's brought these possibilities now. And things are evolving, things are moving. We have high support on many of these things that we're bringing our youth to. We have seen, right there, I have the wellness support. We often see treatment or addiction counseling or this and that has not really clicked for many of our youth on up to adulthood. But once they connect to who and what they are, once they get into their culture, their life will completely change. So what does that mean? what is happening there? And there's a lot of documentation around that. One thing about me is I'm horrible on getting the data and things like that. But if you guys ever want, I could get you a lot of connections to such documentation, because our culture and language is prevention. You look at that across the board. Some of our most successful athletes and academics are centered in their culture. They pretty savvy on their language. They know who and what they are. So those are some of the things that we look at through consultation. And this goes both ways. I often believe I've seen folks that are non-Indian come into our school systems. There's often a shock to the system because of all the loss that folks who aren't used to that will start to take in. And it's very difficult and it's very tough. We've tried to create programs for incoming out of res or non-Indians coming into the tribe to have a adopt a teacher program. We've even had students adopt a teacher. If there's an event happening, take them by the arm and take them to that event. Explain what's happening out on that dance or at the powwow. Explain this, explain that. And I truly believe that just the immersion into that culture goes a lot further than reading about it in a book or a 2-hour training on cultural diversity. I think that we have these abilities, and going back to what I said earlier, to lead with love and to take care of each other as humans. I've often had teachers that are non-Indian say, I don't know how to work with these kids. And I said, do you have kids of your own? Yes, I do. Then you know how to work with these kids. It's sometimes I think we overcomplicate some of these initiatives and some of this approach. We'll think a shiny program from the outside is going to fix it, but it's really us being human, us being the best human that we have, and we have the compassion inside of us to get to know each other and to build those relationships, and you'll see a change. Of course, I had to throw an athletic side up there, but I get into these discussions. If anybody on this call ever wants to call and visit, I am all for it. I love it. I love to share ideas and hear others' thoughts and figure out ways. Sometimes our tribal communities are really described as desolate, as addictive. There's abuse, there's drugs and alcohol, there's all of these hardships. And sometimes, us folks from those tribal communities jump on that. And I get it. I mean, I've done that. But one time I was sitting there and I was thinking, what if we described our athletic teams like we do our communities? Oh boy, that basketball team, geez, they're depressed. They got addiction all through their family. It's not looking good. Those teams wouldn't. It's just a concept that just kind of blows my mind, because we never do that. My dream has always been to describe our communities, no matter how they are, as we do our athletic teams. Provide the support to each other as we do our athletic teams. So then I started to think, well, why is that? What is this energy that athletics brings? And again, this is my opinion. Oftentimes in our communities, that team is the positive energy. I've seen enemies high-fiving at state tournaments while them young people are out there playing. It unites us as a tribe as we once were. And so I believe that if that happens out there, it could happen everywhere. And I think even within our school system, I've always thought we should have a coaching clinic for teachers, and then have coaches go through a teacher's clinic, because there's different skills that you need. But the way we describe our teams, the support that we give them, it's very reminiscent of what our tribes were. It's the display of our sovereignty in its purest form. Yeah, there's rules, and yeah, you could sit here and say that ref did us in and this one didn't, but we're at least allowed to live in self-actualization as an athlete out there. And that's a deep statement right there, but that's what I'm talking about. You can see these pictures. I mean, a lot of pride there in those photos. So as we've maintained this sovereignty and as we've started to revitalize a lot of our culture, our elders held it tight and close, especially our women. Our women are our most powerful in Blackfeet. But you look at kids, you set an elder in a school in the hallway. Most of those kids will understand it. I must respect that. Oh, I can't do that. You put smudge or sweetgrass sitting there. Those kids will know, don't act up over there. So like looking at some of these ways to support our school systems through what we've held on through sovereignty, one of the biggest things is bringing our elders and knowledge keepers in, teaching that self-identity and pride. I often work with youth and the statement comes up, well, we're second class, we're this and that. And again, I say this in the nicest way that I can. Our tribal nations, our indigenous nations are the only undefeated people in this continent because we still hold our sacred indigenous land. We still hold our indigenous languages. We still are where we're at. And for people that will sometimes take offense to me saying that, they say, well, you just had a taste of what our people have felt by being erased out of history, by being erased and said, oh, you guys were defeated. It wears on our people. We're a strong, beautiful, powerful people out there. They're all across the board. And it doesn't matter where you come from again. That belief in self and that self-identity creates a good sense of feeling, creates pride. Again, going back to sports, people are healthier during basketball season in Indian country. They're healthier during basketball season in our rural communities. You go to Lewistown, they're healthy. There's all kinds of ways that we can have the self-belief without tearing each other down. And so like getting back into those things, these knowledge keepers hold that. And they really want you to be strong in who and what you are. And there's stories that lay that. I think that's within every one of us, probably on the call, if folks haven't left yet. So this is kind of looking at, I've probably covered quite a bit of this. Jennifer told me to just keep talking. I don't even know what slide I'm on right now, but sovereignty has provided us with the who and what we are. It's and within that, within our knowledge keepers, if someone chooses to go in that direction, which is whoever decision, it's whatever they want to do, but there's a roadmap to self-identity. And I could go back across that ocean again. You know, I often talk with one of my good friends is Norwegian, and he looks like a Viking. He's got a 2-foot long red beard, and he's joined this group of Viking descendants. And we were talking about things, and he was talking about the Norse gods and all kinds of stuff and how they were labeled as mythology. And he said, you know, we talk about that. We actually, those were our gods. That's his direction. Well, we have the same thing in a lot of our indigenous nations. Their stories. What I have understood, some of those folks at these high levels within our stories, what I have been told by certain elders is that DNA is within all of us. We're connected to those stories because that DNA has been passed on. So I look at it in the same way. You know, like I said, I'm Irish and German as well. I was once told that the Irish had a pipe very similar to the Oninin, the Grovan tribe. One of my great mentors, Gerald Stiffarm, told me that story. And they had a lodge that faced east, and they would sit in that lodge. So I'm always curious about so much of this stuff. And that's what sovereignty has afforded us, you know, guided us. And in our knowledge keepers, our songs, our stories, it's all intertwined with that. Anytime I meet somebody who is non-native, there's a curiosity, and I've always wanted to be open to these discussions, even if they're heated discussions. But I believe that we bring each other into that. I get questions all the time about sweetgrass or whatever it may be. If I don't know what I don't know, I'll seek that and I'll get back to you. But there's such a beauty when we start to share these cultures. You know, when I go anywhere, I always like to know who and what I am. And I think within the state of Montana, If we open up these connections and start to connect our school districts, no matter where they are, with some of our knowledge keepers, with some of our stories, of course, being careful and not sharing what the elders would not want you to share, but starting to open up a communication, I think it can make a big difference. I do it in youth leadership. I'll bring different groups from different backgrounds, some border towns to the rest, which oftentimes don't get along. I get those students in the room, you start talking music, they start exchanging their snaps, they start going, and they're there together. And there's all that outside noise just stops. And I believe we can do that more often in our state. And so the data shows we've tried a lot in our systems. You know, the the extreme measures of the boarding schools and the missions on into today, where we're still trying to work in a system that is really needs to evolve out of the industrial revolution system. And this isn't just for our native communities, it's across the board. The answer to the bell, the walk the line, 60 blocks or 60-minute blocks of a class. Um, you look at the alternative schools that supposedly take some of our most needy kids, and those kids succeed and they flourish. There's something happening there. Block scheduling or project-based learning, land-based education, getting kids out there and discussing the science, the math, the English, the whatever it may be, while sitting out on that land. Those type of things are there. And I think across the board, our youth are moving our education to evolve, because they can get an answer. Back when we had to memorize everything, they can get an answer in 5 seconds from Google, and it's most likely correct answer. Yet we're still trying to teach in the same manner. That's why I love having students there to help me understand how they're learning and where they want to take education. So that's a lot of what we do in our work. Is we do a lot of pilot approaches in our native schools, and they work. You know, again, I'll bring up Hart Butte. You got Browning doing many amazing things. You got uh, Lame Deer has tried various things all the way over to Poplar, Brockton, Fraser, Wolf. I mean, all of them. Hayes Lodgepole. I've practically lived in Hayes for 3 years. I almost didn't make it in my marriage because I was living up there, but I love that place a lot. And my kids didn't even know who I was. I come home but it was a good time. When I work, I go all in a lot of times. And so there's a lot that is happening out there. Teaching those traditional understandings, all that we do in life is to become the best human that we possibly can. Getting some of our elders involved, seeing our youth centered in who and what they are, and loving that first and foremost. Everything else will fall into place. But that's kind of where we're at with a lot of the work that we're doing. When I first put together the Tribal Relations and Resiliency Unit, I asked our superintendent, I said, I would like to create, following a traditional tribal protocol, a group of elders to guide us as we look at bringing in mental health services and support, bringing in self-identity, bringing in land-based knowledge of the area. There's so much knowledge and history within our mountains and streams and land base around the state. I find people very curious of this. What was this called before it was called this? Or what happened over here? What are the histories of Montana from that aspect? Well, a lot of that knowledge is sitting within our knowledge keepers. I wanted to share, you see that first bullet. This was an idea that was brought to me by an elder from Canada. They created an Elder and Cultural Wisdom Council up there. And it was to work with helping our students, and it was through child services. It intrigued me. And I said, I want to try something like that here. Well, so we took that turn, and I was able to gather folks from across the state and have a discussion around, what do you guys want to name yourselves? There was such a long discussion around elder and how elder often equates to age, but knowledge keeper. You could have a 6-year-old with stories and transferred rights and understandings of such things that could be considered a knowledge keeper or elder in this term. So they changed it to the kin. I like it, knowledge keepers of the indigenous nations. This is we're about almost a year in with this group. I mean, working on different kind of ways. We want to look at ways to get access from school districts. You know, you receive money for EFA, you receive money for ASA. I showed you the programs for title. What if we were to start to bring in direct access to such folks, from equine to beadwork to the stories of that land that your school may be on? Direct access from our districts into such folks, get them in face to face. I say it in this way: if I'm going to go to let me think, where do I want to go? To Greece. I could go buy a book and learn a lot about Greece. Well, what if I got a man that grew up and born and raised, lived in Greece, that was my next door neighbor? What am I going to learn more from that book? Or if I go sit down with that man and have some probably tea or whatever they'd be drinking over there, coffee, and sat and learn from him in that way? We have that ability in the state with 8 sovereign nations. And can we open up those lines of communication and start to connect many of our school districts into this knowledge, that face to face? My son, he's a young man here, 6th grader at Montana City. I'm going to work at bringing in some of our students from up in Browning, maybe bring in the Cutswood students, come down and sit down with these kids here, speak their language, talk about who and what they are. When you're in those type of settings, there's a respect that's built. It's very different than learning from a book. And I understand that. I mean, curriculum, everything, all that's good. But with this group, we're very slowly moving in an idea that, can we start to do this? Can you identify folks? Jennifer had an amazing ethnobotany series. The plant knowledge out there is just immense. It's unbelievable, the knowledge that could be shared. From so many different aspects, the animals, all of the things. I mean, it's just, there's such a wealth of knowledge that we could tap into. So some of that work, we're again being very careful, and I'm running it through these guys and gals. We have amazing people on that group. But this is kind of, those 8 sovereign nations in that hold that knowledge is what we're going to tap into. We're going to look at going right to the source. And we're already doing it in many places. So when we start to do such things like that, I used to work with MBI. Those that remember the Montana Behavioral Initiative, MBI, old Susan Bailey Anderson, legend, a good friend of mine. She started to work with me on a project to look at school climate transformation, school climates. How can we bring better supports in our school systems? They used to have, and many school districts still have that, the 4 B's, be respectful, be nice, all these things like that. When I started to look at changing or adding in some tribal input, what you start to understand that there, within each tribe, usually these words have a story behind it. So we started to talk about, would we be able to share these stories as we look at changing the school climate? Would we be able to bring in some of our knowledge keepers to talk about, respect, wisdom, love, generosity? Some of our schools, like Heart Butte there, created their own, and they talked at becoming a warrior. And so there is stories around those 4 individuals sitting right there, I mean, legends around that. And it's really the concept that you're teaching kind of a different, kids remember the stories. I'll just say it simply like that. And then you can tie in other teachings. But we started to move in this direction. Again, a lot of the stuff that I'm talking about is centering our kids in who and what they are, and having them be balanced within themselves. And I'll show you another framework a little bit later. But here's the vision, and this is kind of the direction. Again, Jennifer gave me some of the responses, and I wanted to show this. And again, maybe we can reach out or work together. These are some things that are happening out there through our tribes and our school districts and our state working together. These are some things that are even ideas that have come up from the youth, programs and support systems to get them through. So this is an exciting time because we're ready, willing to bring in an outsider, the indigenous understandings into our school systems. So here's where I'd say, does anybody have any questions on any of these programs? But some really good stuff is happening. So when I did the school climate transformation grant, it was tied to our Schools of Promise initiative. Again, so this was changing the environment of the school, the tiered support systems. And so what I first did is I worked with Susan Bailey Anderson. And I said, I'd like to convene some knowledge keepers or elders at that time. I said, and I'd like to look at what they think, because some of them were working in JDC, juvenile detention centers. They were bringing in different kind of support systems. In one school, we convened a group of elders with the administration. And I'll give you an example. Again, we're horrible at collecting data, but this is a very powerful story. The year before, from September to the end of October, there were 76 incidents of discipline, and I think 4 expulsions or something like that. Multiple fights in the school district. We pulled in some of the elders and said, what can we do again to blur the lines? Because I know those kids don't act like that over here. And they come here and it's just, so we started to have a conversation. What would something like that look like? This school district decided to have a morning reflection where they started every morning off with the drum. They gave out announcements. They passed out good feelings. Some told stories and gave it to others. Everything they did, if they sang a song, they explained what that song was about. They got other kids involved. They said the Pledge of Allegiance in all 3 of their languages, because there's an understanding from many of them old indigenous veterans that when we fight for our country, our tribal nations have the highest percentage rate per capita as veterans and soldiers. We shook hands. We did our part. We fight for the country. So to have that language in that Pledge of Allegiance, it was very interesting. But one of the knowledge keepers told me where we're connected to the land through this part of the pledge. So kids would get up and they'd speak in their 3 languages. It was just a beautiful thing. And then they had a smudge box there, and they offered the smudge. If somebody wanted to light smudge, they could. And never forced, never nothing. So we implemented that in that school. They implemented it. I just watched and observed, and it was a beautiful thing. From September to the end of October that next year, 6 issues of discipline, from 76 to 6. Kids were starting to understand, and they didn't even know. When I talk about something like sweetgrass, and I don't know nothing about nothing, but I'll tell you that there's ingredients within that sweetgrass that calms the mind, centers. And I would joke and say that one smudge of sweetgrass those kids did is like a week of counseling over here. Then to have elders there, grandmas, grandpas, folks there, it changed the whole aspect of that school. And the grades started to move in a better way, in a positive way. Sometimes, as the kids calmed down, it often exposed teachers who used to blame those kids for their grades. It exposed that they weren't the best teachers. So there's that side too. There's a lot of blame that's thrown on our kids. Our kids go through a lot. And that's where I go back to what I began talking about in the beginning is I want our kids to live longer, healthier lives. They're dealing with stuff. I want to break those chains that were connected to our ankles from boarding schools and missions. I want that abuse in the passing on of it to be broke and us to live in a beautiful, loving life. I know in my experience over the years, we each do better. We each try our best. I know that I tell my folks are the most loving people around, but I tell my son and my daughter I love them every day. I didn't have that, but I'm Gen Xer. We didn't have a lot, so but I make sure now. There's no question my kids have any worries about this stuff. So it's an individual experience. So we started to look at ways to calm the mind, get the kids to a place that they're ready to learn, provide a place to some called it a refocus room, some called it this and that, but where there's elders sitting in there, folks of support. Start getting snack shops over on the side or different kind of things. Having a representation of the language and identity. Heart Butte has taken this to a whole nother level. They got, you could walk into our schools, I'd say 10 years ago, 20 years ago, you wouldn't even know you were in an Indian school. Now we have murals being painted. You're starting to see who and what we are. There's stories behind those murals. There's more imagery of the beauty and the pride and the strength of Indigenous people. Our people were always the cleanest, most well-dressed you could ever imagine. You look at those old photos, that's how it was. I had one elder say that it took him 2 hours to get his braids done in the morning. His grandfather told him that story. Just perfect. And so like getting that stuff within our school systems, you're starting to see it. It's getting bigger and better. It's just unbelievable. You got the nutrition, the returning of the buffalo. There's so much to that we could have an entire series on that as well. But always looking in a strengths-based way, always finding those elders to guide us and teach us in the knowledge that maybe our community holds or our tribe holds. And then moving up even further to that tier 2, those healing rooms, different kind of things. Some schools offered a sweat lodge in a weekend, just to watch out. Again, the school boards can pass certain things, but being very careful on what that looked like, that was probably 5-6 years ago. But those kids that were attending that started to reconnect. They started to do better in school. Talking circles are a big thing. It's kind of inclusive of restorative practice, restorative circles, different things like that. I like to call them relational. We've encouraged school districts. We've offered training. Crystal Hickman does training around restorative circles or relational circles. Just giving an option to say, hey, try to do a circle twice a week with your students. 30-minute circle, check in. Get to know them a little bit with the teacher included. The vulnerability of that, where the kids will start to see that teacher as a human. It'll build those relationships. So the teachers that were doing that, their school, their classroom was better maintained. They didn't have a lot of the discipline issues because you're building relationships. I think that's the biggest part of everything, is to build those relationships. So those type of things are happening. If you're interested, contact me. Then we had, of course, the wraparound programs that we've done, where the students in the middle and they choose their wraparound support team. Equine therapy, horse therapy, different kind of other things at those upper levels, that was the result of some pretty amazing discussions. School districts started to incorporate their clan systems, started to get kids into a place that, hey, you don't treat that kid like that. He's your clan brother. And that 10-year-old, you're supposed to listen to him. You're 9. And you 10-year-old, you're supposed to take care of that 9-year-old. So these simple understandings really are ingrained in our tribal ways of learning and loving. And again, afforded through sovereignty. This is a framework that some schools are taking, where the 4 components of a holistic school system, safety, culture, and self-identity, holistic wellness, and instruction. We focus so much on instruction. COVID taught many of us, including the students. You look at the data, the biggest thing students are dealing with is that mental health, is all of those anxiety, and there's different things that pop up, and we all have our opinions of them, but you can't discount that kids are feeling in certain ways. So can we get their brain calm? Can we get them to a place? There's many of our own Indigenous practice that can help to lead that. Grades will go up, but mainly that person will become a more centered and balanced individual. But that's something too that if you're ever interested, contact us. That holistic framework. And again, this is not only in our tribal nations. There was a incident here. My daughter goes to Helena High. There was a tough incident. There was a suicide. And one thing that happens in our communities when something happens, I mean, things get shut down. Elders are brought in, talking circles are put in place. It really takes a while. If you guys watch Reservation Dogs, it's on Hulu or FX. Look at the concept of that 2 seasons. The entire base of it is on the loss of a young man who suicided. That's the impact that this stuff has. And yeah, I could talk a long time on that and the situations I've been through. But to sit here and be in a call and hear of a school district that was non-Indian have 9 suicides in 1 year, my jaw hit the floor. That happens in Indian country. There's a lot of news on it. It'll talk about it. Rash of suicides, Indian country. Well, our kids are suffering no matter where they are. And like I say, the pendulum swings both ways. Many of the things that I've brought up that we've been able to hold as Indigenous people work wherever. Just like many of the things in a westernized approach work wherever. And it's really looking at those options and coming together for each other in those ways. So again, this is a great model and idea, and we do have some discussion points that we can share on. So I hit that right at 5:20. So I know some of you may not have thought that this is what you were going to hear today. I did look at a lot of the other sovereignty presentations. So I just wanted to share what we use it for and what is given us as Indigenous people. And then through our resiliency, maintained through our sovereignty, an elder that I really look up to, he says he has an issue with the word decolonize. He says, how far are we going to decolonize? I like my TV. Another one says, I like my chainsaw. How far are we going to go? So they move more into the term of coexist. So braiding the knowledge that these two worlds share could really bring some beautiful things. And I love that quote from Sitting Bull. So I hope that I conveyed the message that we're all in this together. We have very relatable history, some 1,000 years ago, some 100, 150 years ago. So as we move forward together, this is a time that we come together as a people for those youth. So I think that that's my presentation, Jennifer. I could go through some of those questions, but if there's anything out there that you wanted me to cover, go ahead. So thank you to everyone.
Oh, this is fantastic. Thank you so much, Donnie. I really love hearing about your work and our work, from your perspective. And I think it really shows the complexity, of what we do to support education in Indian country and particularly uphold educational sovereignty, for tribes. So there is one question in the chat about the idea that was presented by a Montana state senator to get rid of the reservations. And I did put Chairman Grace from the Little Shell, Chippewa, on the resources sheet. But anyhow, do you have any comments on getting rid of reservations and how that might not necessarily uphold sovereignty?
Yeah, I do. I probably can't say a lot of it here, but I think that, I think it's miseducation. It's people not understanding those treaties, not understanding the term and the strength of sovereignty for something like that to happen. There's so many steps. And when I read that, I'm like, thinking that this person doesn't know a lot about the histories and a lot about the Constitution and the treaties that are written within them. And that's okay. I'm always one is I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, but once it's told to them and they continue to go, then I know what kind of person they are. So I don't know about this individual. I don't know if they just didn't know. But yeah, what that did is it caused me to start to research some of the termination policies of the 50s and 60s. And that's where my grandfather, Blackie, was front and center. That's when he was chairman of the NCAI. And again, there was 109 tribes terminated during that time at the federal level. So there's been a lot of history and a lot of changes to make sure that doesn't happen. And for someone to say that, I just don't believe they understand. And I know that our people are Indigenous. We have a really solid identity. And like I said earlier, I think people want us to just be American, but we're so much more than that. We are that, but we're also rooted in this nation of thousands of years of knowledge and identity. And it's the connection to the land. Some of that stuff is often related to money too. There's always a shot going after our tribal lands. They've done it over the years. So you just wonder. There's always something up. But that's what I'd say. Maybe they don't know what they don't know. I often don't like to jump when a lot of people get like that, because it takes away our energy from what we're actually doing that's working, because there isn't a lot that person that they can do, really. So I'd rather keep doing what we're doing here, if that helps.
It does place an emphasis on the job that we need to continue doing in Indian Ed for All, and with the essential understandings in classrooms, that's for sure. Another question in chat is, can you repeat what you had said about the Indo people and what that had meant again, related to when Columbus sailed this way?
What I was told by, again, one of he's like my brother, is when Columbus was set sail, and I've tried to find a map, he said that the country of India wasn't even there. It had a different name. And he said, so when Columbus, in Spanish, en Dio means in God, that they're in God. So he was saying that they said en Dio, and it's tied to Indian, but that our people were in God. They were perfect. They were beautiful. And of course, you read his journals a little bit later, but that was the first initial thing. And again, there's different stories around that. I used to say, a guy was lost, whatever. But I've chosen to I like that one, because a lot of that stuff you can't go back, and I choose to move in that direction, if that answers that question. En Dio, you can look it up, and it means in God. So our people were in God from their eyes,
Still are sacred.
Yes.
This was not mentioned in the history books, our participant says, so thank you for that. I'd really like for you, I know, just because I know you and I know the work that you do, but could you share with us a little about the importance of Native youth and their leadership and empowering them, and is there anything that classroom teachers can do to really support young Native youth leaders?
Yeah, I of course I follow a lot of coaching philosophies around this, but I think that any type of situation where I've been dealing with students that may be a little bit rambunctious or causing issues, if you can get to a place that you say, well, help me develop this plan. Tell me what your solutions are. Any youth that I deal with, I say, if you have a problem, you better have identified a solution, because we have enough people focusing on the problem. So oftentimes if you could bring them into whatever the situation is, and I know sometimes that does not work at all either, but really respecting them as we expect them to respect us. I was always told and taught you should when you're making decisions, you should have every generation represented because they bring very unique perspectives. So getting them involved in the decision making. You know, we had youth that were approaching the school board around attendance issues of teachers. And, you know, some of these things, again, like when we talk about, I had a discussion around, hey, would you guys like to have a podcast training? And the student said, we don't even listen to podcasts. And I'm like, well, so what do you think then? But really asking them. One student told me, his name is Jared Whitebull, he's from Ethity, Wyoming. He said, adults always tell us what to do. They never ask us what to do. And so really just keeping them in those discussions can be very powerful. And if they bring up a solution, run with it. And if you can't, explain why. Just being human to each other is one of the best approaches, I believe.
Well, thank you. This really was a fantastic way to wrap up an extraordinary series. Thank you so much for your contribution and for your passion. And thank you so much for your leadership in Montana, Donnie. So everyone, please come join us at the Indian Education for All Best Practices Conference, March 17th and 18th. I put the registration link in the chat. Also, what are you doing that's really fantastic in your classroom? Please come share it with us and put in a call for proposal. That link is in the chat as well. There is going to be a sovereignty curriculum development workshop as a pre-conference workshop on March 17th here in Helena before the conference gets kicked off. And we would love to have your participation in that. So it is first come, first serve. Make sure to get registered for that. Other than that, stay safe, stay warm, and we will be announcing a new webinar series here soon. And so keep posted on our Indian Education for All upcoming professional development events so that you can know what's happening next and get registered for it. We also have a hub course starting. You can find more about that on our website. It is Building Your Indian Education for All Mindset. It will be facilitated and it is going to be fantastic. So thank you all so much. If I missed your question because we've run out of time, please make sure just to pop that into an email over to Donnie, and I am sure that he will get back to you. So thank you, everybody, and thank you so much for your participation in this wonderful series. Take care.